and Jimena, you must watch that because what they're doing in Ecuador is really good. And then I said, of course, I mean, I said this wasn't in Spanish, so let's do a short Spanish one, which Gabriela did. So it took time, but I said, must put it out because their experience is really good because the court aspect everyone keeps talking about, and here they don't have it. And mediation, like Jimena was saying, experience and letting people experience it. That's the main thing. And it's really has taken off. So that was good. But Teresa, thank you very much for being part of the symposium. Haven't seen you for quite some time. I hope you've been all right. Everything good?
Yes, good.
Good.
Yes, you?
So you can
I've
see
seen you because I see you. I do, check in and watch and see what's going on. So I guess I do feel like I'm more up to date with what you've been doing. You've been very busy.
The idea was not to do anything like this, no symposium and all. The idea was to just push the World Mediation Circle, but this was something which will affect that. This will definitely affect it. So I said, let's have a discussion on legislation, because the way I want to take that World Mediation Circle, legislation should not come in the way. And if it's coming in the way, if you discuss it, things you can always legislate and over legislate, but is it going in the right direction? So this is what it was about. But I'm going to let you come in and talk about yourself after 10 seconds. Let me just put this up. This is what we're doing. Mediation legislation, how, what, when, where, which, who, why of it. And of course, Teresa is going to tell us about herself. There's no time. Now imagine there's no time for me to even put up mediatorvikram.com and tell people to go there. So I'm not going to do that. We'll go straight to the topic. So it's all yours. Tell us about yourself, the topic, wherever, please.
So like Andrea, I don't have a legal background. I am licensed as a psychologist in Florida, which is in the United States. And I work primarily now as if you're talking labels and hats, as a mediator, a collaborative neutral, parenting plan and co-parenting consultant. I still do a little bit of what we consider counseling or psychotherapy here, but mostly I'm working professionally in this space of helping people resolve differences, most of which, but not all, most of which have some sort of legal implication. And so somewhere along the way, they may choose to file something, they may not, they may choose to reach an agreement that is going to be something that the court could enforce in the future if they have had any difficulties later with what they've agreed to. But primarily my goal is to try to help people find a way to, retain that ownership of their decision-making and finding some ways to work through their differences. So, when this topic is of interest to me, and you and I have touched on because you're very well aware of what's going on in Florida, some of which you've expressed lots of concerns about. So, we've sort of touched on this topic. So when I saw it pop up again, I was like, oh, I want to participate in that. And then I watched some of the early ones and thought, maybe he wants to hear from a lawyer more about the legislation. And then I saw a few others, and I see a wonderful mix of trying to look at this from all angles. And so I'll just make a couple of introductory comments, and then we have a couple of different directions we could go. I purposely listened to some this morning so that maybe we could do something a little bit different. So first, Vikram, I think the way you sort of put this out there, and I'm sure I'll leave a W word out, who, what, when, where, why, which, whatever, how, all these things, which is, an H word. I think that's perfect, because as we think about how mediation appears around the world in all of these different or processes similar to mediation, I don't think that there is a one-size-fits-all sort of mediation legislation that's going to fit every community and every need. And I think it is really important to look in context. And as I listen, even listening to, and I didn't catch your name, the woman from Turkey earlier.
Ashian.
And I think of I was listening to some of the features of their legislation and rules, and I can hear in there as I listen what I think are attempts to course correct, to learn from other communities, try to fit it to your particular community and correct problems or challenges that have come up with certain aspects of legislation. But sometimes when we try to course correct, we drift too far another way, and then some other areas trying to course correct back this way. So I do think this way that you framed it is really important, because we want to look at all aspects. The other things I want to put out there is an area of agreement that we have, because I know if I don't put it out, you're going to try to find a way to pull it out. So I'll just put it out here at the beginning. But I'll say it may be a little different than you would. I don't think that mediation is going to fix what ails us as humans in this area of differences and disputes. And I completely agree with you that this is an inside-out sort of process. I just don't know how to accomplish that inside-out sort of process where individuals begin to say, this is not working, and I need to recognize that I'm going to have differences with other people, and those differences sometimes turn into disputes, and I want to individually try to find ways to manage or resolve those differences in a peaceful way, that I retain some ownership of how those issues get resolved. And then when I can't, somewhere along the way, whether it's with a neighbor, a family member, a friend, another business, I'm unable to manage or resolve, that I have someone that I can go to, a trusted person that's going to help talk me through those differences. And I want to see that grow. I don't want to see that concept be replaced or overtaken by mediation and as an institutionalized sort of process. I don't want to see that be overtaken. But at the same time, I'm not going to be around long enough to wait to see the inside out changes that I would like to see, and the between people changes that I would like to see. And so I am in this space where we have, I think it's very well known, we have a really dysfunctional legal system here that is litigation heavy, and out of everyone's, not everyone, out of many people's mouths, when a problem comes up, it was just sue them, right? It's well known. It's been talked about in many of these little 30-minute things. So I'm in that space, and I want to see processes like mediation or similar processes be useful within that space. But when you have a difference or a dispute that might actually have some implication related to some other structure in your society, like a property line that neighbors can try to stay out of a dispute where they need to know where that line is until someone wants to sell their piece of property. And then it has implications in other aspects where society has said, we're going to have some rules or regulations around how property sales occur, around how the sale of an automobile occurs, or whatever else. You know what I'm talking about. So within that structure, I think that some level of legislation or rules around a process within space where people may have some sort of overarching legal construct that they're trying to resolve makes some sense. But every time we add a piece of legislation, as I said earlier, or a rule, or well, let's fix this issue, well, let's think we can fix this issue with the legislation, we do create another issue or concern. So that's sort of the foundation for me of where I come at this. And I didn't even get to the training piece, but I will get to that. But maybe talking a bit about, instead of our legislation, which I think is the way the US has approached legislating mediation, I think has already been discussed in many of these 30-minute little presentations. But I would love to be able to talk about some of the challenges and some of the opportunities potentially, as well as maybe to follow up. You had a speaker last week, Elise, who is here in my area, and she did a fine job of identifying some of the difficulties, some of the challenges that have occurred where we have had mediation legislation since the 1970s, 1980s. And yet I have maybe a picture of some other things that are going on that don't get talked about as often in a place where we rely upon our mediation legislation to define a lot of what occurs, at least in disputes that have a potential to have a legal aspect.
But has Elise connected with you?
No.
Okay. No, but
Yeah,
she's
so we'll have to
really,
do that. Yeah,
you should
well,
do that. No, she's a I see I wonderful person, and she's a
yes,
genuine person that you meet sometime. And from the other side, she wants to develop this practice. But
right.
what is really happening in the in the court system? Because she's actually going through something in the court, and she's seeing how things
I
are
did
there.
hear
So
that.
yeah.
Yes.
But on the other end, maybe Teresa, what you can start with is the areas where there is no legislation. Let's look at work outside
Okay,
the court system. Let's start from
sure.
there, because that gets left out sometimes.
Yes, and that's one of the things, and actually, I'm going to bring up age. So Elise decided to share her age, and so the one of the pieces of information is I'm almost 30 years older than she is.
So you know your age.
So, yep, which is fine with me. So the point of that is, 3 decades, very, very close to 3 decades of experience in this idea of mediation. And so I have some opportunities because of that time and my experience to participate in mediation outside of the court system. And so how does that occur for me? Well, first of all, let me tell you what occurs outside of my office that doesn't involve me, but I hear about it when they come to me in a positive way. I hear about situations where, and mostly the space I work in is family, although, as you know, in Florida, there are multiple areas of certification. I have all of those areas of certification, but I do almost all family-related mediation. So when folks come to me, often I hear stories about how they work to resolve their differences before they got to me. And so that sometimes when they get to me, it's because they weren't able to. Sometimes it's they were able to resolve aspects of it. So what do I hear about? Well, they worked on it in, at their kitchen table with the husband says, my mother-in-law has always been really great at being able to help us. And so she sat down and we worked on these parts. We just need to write it up. We've solved that. Or we went to our rabbi, or we went to our preacher. And so I still hear in my community, in spite of how litigious we are, I regularly hear about people who are sitting, maybe not under the tree, right? Some of those conversations you've had with Sarah Blake, but certainly in the dining room, at the kitchen table, using people in their community to help them come up with some of their own agreements around the matters that they know they're going to have to address in this family transition. Other situations that occur for me is folks who know that they ultimately need to get a legal divorce for other aspects, but their idea is to present to the judge their finished product and to file it all at once, essentially. And they do that by using the resources that they've heard about, that they find when they do an internet search. So I do get calls into my office that say, we're looking for someone to mediate for us. We want to sit down and talk about our parenting plan. We want to figure out how we're going to, pay for housing and those sorts of things going forward. Can you mediate for us? Sometimes they've heard about me from a neighbor. Sometimes they found me online. Sometimes they might go to the flcourts.org website where there's a list of certified mediators and they start reaching out to people there. But essentially they're saying we would like to have some preliminary conversations. Sometimes they already have lawyers and the lawyers say, call Teresa. We want you to sit down with her. We don't need to be there. You can sit down with her, have a few conversations around these parenting issues that we know you have some differences about, and then come back to us. In the meantime, we'll be working on the other aspects of your situation that don't have anything to do with Teresa. And then eventually you'll report back to us and we'll continue on and find a resolution, sometimes with a mediator, sometimes not. The other part that isn't often talked about, I know Vikram, sometimes you've heard some stories about folks who want to be a mediator and they take a training and they start doing pro bono mediations, and then they give up because they can't get any work. And numbers related to, you've got, whatever, 8,000 mediators, and how many of those people are working? I know many lawyers in my community that take mediation training. They have no intention of becoming certified mediators or doing mediation. What they want is to improve their knowledge and skills around how to create better conversations with their clients, and how to create better conversations when they get on the phone with the other lawyer, or when they have a four-way without a mediator with the two clients in it. And so their motivation isn't to work in this space professionally, but to learn skills and to talk to other people that are trying to help people find their own resolutions. The other part that comes to me that I wish would improve are matters that where someone calls and says, we could really use someone, and sometimes they use the word mediation or mediator, sometimes they don't. We could really use someone to talk through this issue. And maybe they reach out to me a time or two. This is where we need more societal change. They can't get their fill in the blank, their sister, their father-in-law, all of their siblings to sit down and talk about a conflict in the family, or as some issues related to an aging parent. And so they're not able, and they're really disappointed. They're not able to convince those other people to come into the space and have those conversations. And then the last area that's a little more, this one, I think you sort of asked, like outside of the court, this is a little more directly related to the court. I do want to clarify that here in Central Florida, definitely there is voluntary mediation and pre-suit mediation. So there seems to be a perception maybe that you have to file something before you can go to mediation. That's not how it occurs here. And actually voluntary and pre-suit mediation, like it or not, it now has some confidentiality coverage per our statute and rules. So there are folks who come to formal mediation using a certified or non-certified mediator that, as I said earlier, they're going to have something filed potentially, but not always. But they decide to stay out of the court system until they have their agreement all ready to go. So I don't know, what I don't know and can't assess is how much our mediation legislation has impacted the awareness of mediation and mediation type processes so people reach out. I can tell you I was at a meeting recently, and it was a sort of a historical perspective on the collaborative law movement here in Central Florida. And a judge and a lawyer were on the panel, both older than I am. And they were talking about the history of mediation and remembering when mediation started to become a thing. And then there was this legislation, and then it became judges could order folks to mediation. And then it became this mandatory mediation concept. And they were talking about how they personally, as well as many people they knew, said, this is ridiculous. This is never going to amount to anything. This is never going to work. And of course, it didn't take very long for there to be recognition that it does work, and it's still around, and it has its place. And I think that sitting judge who's retiring in the next month or so would agree with what I'm going to say next, which is we also have judges that so believe in the process of mediation that when unfortunately people do go ahead with their process and they end up in front of the judge, there's a number of judges that are very supportive of saying, I want you to go back to mediation. I want you to try again. This issue that you're bringing to me, or certain issues, they don't belong here. They belong with the two of you making decisions. And so I want you to go again. There's time. You have 10 days before trial starts. So those are sometimes the less fortunate, then lawyers are calling around looking for someone who has space within the next 8 days to do mediation. And we could have all kinds of conversations around, does that pressure people? And what I can tell you is I've worked in some of those situations where the clients left so incredibly grateful that they were sent back again to mediation, and that they were able to work really hard with this little team that they didn't initially see as a team to help them conclude the things that they needed to conclude. And so those are some of the positive stories that I see here in Central Florida.
But Teresa, what you really have to talk about is the fact that you said that, of course, it's a ridiculous concept, it won't work, and it has worked. Now, that part of it you have to tell us. When you said it has worked, what is the criteria to say that something has worked, and why it has worked? Because that's the important thing, how we look at that.
That's a really good question. And what I don't know, I was thinking about this morning, and this has happened to me before, but before I was, I should have looked that up. I don't know how well we're tracking. What did people do before they got to mediation, or tracking people who never end up in the mediation space? What do the numbers look like of all of these other scenarios that I mentioned? I know we have some mediation numbers about it working in terms of various variables that could include client satisfaction, a sense of money well spent, an idea that they made movement forward in what they understood about where the other person was, how that person was thinking and feeling, that they'd been in conflict with, that they didn't understand before. Sometimes those measures, as you know, are this concept of settlement, which I know, we could talk about just that piece for the next 30 minutes. So there's lots of different ways to assess. I think if I was speaking for some of the folks that I was having this conversation with recently, success would be defined as many people, I'm not going to say most, because I don't have the data, many people know that there are opportunities other than waiting for your court hearing to find a resolution. Works in the sense of lawyers are in that population, and many lawyers that I know and work with and respect, they're not just telling their clients about mediation because they're required by legislation, like Andrea was talking about in there, right? And we have that here as well. Lawyers have to tell clients about all possibilities, including mediation and now including collaborative as process options. But they're not telling people about those options because they're required. They were telling people long before they were required. So it worked in the sense of lawyers who are gatekeepers to these services for sure, believe that mediation provides an opportunity for their clients to solve all of the things that need to be solved in a way that works for them. And so they want to encourage their clients to take those opportunities.
I think that's where I think maybe, I don't know, let's see how it pans out in various places, because lawyers are the gatekeepers. I think that's where for me, that issue lies, because for me, that they're the gatekeepers of a stage which is much ahead on a dispute. Are we looking at them at that initial stage when things can get resolved? Of course, within themselves. Mediation is a secondary process. I mean, that's another step. But do you get at what point are lawyers coming in? And I think in most countries they come in, I think, a little too soon. So that's, I think, happening everywhere. So I would think for me, success would be where that is a stage. Okay, we'll consider going to a lawyer, but let's look at how we can resolve it within ourselves, or we can get a mediator in. That's when I would think that, yes, mediation is working in the right direction. Otherwise, through the court system, because even in the US, we've had enough discussions on this aspect that, of course, people are going through the process, and yes, settlements are happening, but are they taking that whole process and going out and telling people that you must go through this process? Then in that case, it would have developed differently outside the court system. That did not happen. So we have to understand why that did not happen. We need maybe more information on that, I think.
I don't know why it didn't happen. What do you think?
I think it's because lawyers are controlling the process. It's only that. And I think anything that is connected with that, first of all, the lawyers in the courts, I mean, when is it going to move out of it? It's never going to move out of it, because they will not let it move out of it. And the other aspect of yes, mediators are not developing because of that. They are not looking at this as their full-time thing. So they are used by the lawyers. The mediation is being used by the courts, and mediation is being used by the lawyers. Only person who's being used is the mediator, and they'll move out. Another one will come in. It's a settlement conference. They need a person sitting there. I'm looking at it in a very simple way.
This is what's interesting, though, because I hear that, and I don't disagree with you that happens. And I don't disagree with some of and we could have a whole nother half an hour talking about some of the problems, right? I focus a little more on some of the positives, but I have different experiences. Personally and professionally, I have different experiences with mediation in particular and other processes where there is a very clear recognition by the lawyers who are involved, where clients used their self-determination to decide that they wanted a lawyer to advise them on aspects related to their situation that they don't feel they have the knowledge base. They can have the conversations about what their needs and interests and values and on we could go are, but they don't have the knowledge base to know the ins and outs of whether it's dividing property or child support or other sorts of things. So they've used their self-determination to say, I want a lawyer available to me to help advise me, but I can make decisions for myself. And I want to be in a process where I'm making those decisions with a lawyer advisor, a lawyer counselor. And so in that space, I have lots of experiences where it isn't just a settlement conference, and where getting through the family transition is truly seen as a transition by the lawyers, where we will assist in any way we can to help this family move through and gather the information that they need and have the opportunities for conversation and resolution that they need. And eventually, the goal is to reach a settlement, but it's so much more than a settlement conference. And that was my comment yesterday about there is still heart, soul, and spirituality. And so that'll be my wrap-up sentence. There is still heart, soul, and spirituality in Florida.
I know these three words haven't come in most of my sessions, which is a normal thing which has to come in. But I think the good thing is that you found lawyers who are at least telling people to come to you and have those discussions. So maybe you've got good lawyers around you. That's a good thing. I mean, definitely the legal profession also has good people. It's not that they don't. So it's a good thing that you have that kind of a circle around you who believe that, yes, whenever they can, they'll send it out to someone who can actually discuss certain things, come back to them. So that's definitely something which is a good thing. But I think, of course, these discussions can go on and lots of them have to happen. But important thing is that from your side, is there anything that you look at in terms of legislation? Do you want to give any, or how you would look at legislation, how it should be structured?
That's another conversation. Other than what I said in the beginning, I do think it has to be, the one thing I will say, because I think it relates to this conversation, is continuing to work to help legislation not exclude the opportunity for people to, again, to use your language, to sit under the tree, to sit in their dining room, to use folks that they want to use to help them resolve their disputes. You know, how do we find that balance?
I think that's an interesting thing that you brought out, that you would want this to happen, but will it take too long for this to happen, where organically it develops there? But is legislation going against it and it's not developing because of that? In the last so many years of that happening in the US, has it affected the organic growth? So yes, we have to look at that, because if legislation comes in the way, then it's never going to grow. But then we'd say, oh yes, it's not growing, so we need legislation. So this whole thing will go on. So thank you very much, Teresa. Of course.
Thank you.
And tomorrow workshop, please drop in. There'll be time when everyone can, of course, give their thoughts. So thank you very much, Dimitri. Dimitri, sir, we have to get Dimitri in now. Dimitri, you want to say hi?